This is the Grp A8 synthesizer. It's a monster of a machine. It's not a modular synthesizer as such, but it does have all of the capacity to behave in the way that a modular synthesizer does, in the sense that the intermodulation possibilities on this synthesizer are extraordinary. But it does make it one of the more difficult machines to get started with here at MESS. So what I'm going to do is just go through a few tips to make sure that when you approach this machine in a session, that you're comfortable with at least getting to a certain point. I mean, it's one of my favorite machines to get completely lost in, so that's always an option, but you should at least maybe start from somewhere quantifiable first. So the easiest way to think about this synth is as two separate 3-oscillator synths. It's like here we have 3 oscillators and we have an LFO there, and then it runs through a mixer, a variable state filter, and then a fixed filter bank, and it goes into an envelope section here, an envelope generator and amplifier section here, and then to the right-hand side is the rather incredible sequencer. And then underneath that, it's like you have the second voice, and it's actually divided in the logic of the synthesizer into upper and lower. So there's an upper voice and a lower voice, and a lot of the modulation possibilities rely on you knowing which voice you're working with. So underneath you have, again, 3 oscillators, a mixer section, exactly the same architecture, variable state filter, fixed filter, envelope generator and amplifier, and there's the sequencer. And here we have the main mixer and the panning section, which is also something that you'll have to keep your eyes on. So often what will happen when you approach a machine is that somebody's been working on it before you, and they've probably just switched it off at the end of a session and left a whole lot of crazy sounds happening. So one of the first things that I like to do is I like to go to the mixer section and I turn everything down. Just turn all of the oscillators down. Then I go to any dial that says AMT underneath, which stands for amount, and that's always the amount of a modulation source that you're applying to another sound. So anything here that says AMT, 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 you'll see there are all the modulations for the pulse width, for example, and then there's the FM modulation. Take the amount down, amount down, amount down. Make sure all of these amounts are down. And that means that and the same with the filter, there are amounts of modulation for all the filters here, for various aspects of the filters. So after you've made sure all of these amount dials are in the left position to cancel all of the modulation, it's very important to look down at this low frequency oscillator here. So low frequency oscillator 3 is unique in the sense that it can apply modulation to either the upper voice or the lower voice, and it can apply modulation as an FM modulation to the oscillator, pulse width modulation, voltage control frequency modulation, and an VCA modulation. Now those modulations will apply regardless of whether or not they've been routed on one of these switches. They're kind of universal modulators. So make sure that these are all switched down to the left. Otherwise, you're going to assume you're going to hear that modulation, and it's going to throw you off when you're trying to make a simple voice. So as an example, if I'm just trying to play a note, and this happens to be up, I'll hear that amplitude modulation, or I'll hear the filter modulation, or I'll hear the FM synth. So it's just important to have them all down, otherwise, bring them in later when you're having fun. And then it allows you to basically start to diagnose or start to build a sound from the ground up. So ensuring that on the amplifier section here, you're switched down to keyboard, and then that the main mixer has some volume here. Then what we can do is we can bring up one of the oscillators. We'll just bring up oscillator 1. Each oscillator has a sub VCO that goes with it, which is another thing that makes this synthesizer rather enormous. But that, having turned up that first oscillator, I should be able to press a key on the keyboard and just hear that oscillator. Couldn't be simpler, right? You might think that's relatively uninteresting, but it is the best way to kind of zero this synth. It's the equivalent in modular terms of pulling all the patch cables out, I guess, and then starting from scratch. Once you have a single oscillator, of course, you can add another one, a third. You can hear that sound starting to change, starting to fatten up. If you're not hearing anything, it's going to be really useful to move across to the state variable filter and just have a quick look at what's happening there, because it does operate either as a 24 dB low-pass filter or a 12 dB state variable filter, or they can run in series or they can run in parallel. And this switch here determines those things, whether you're in at the moment we're running through this 24 dB filter, and we're here in low-pass mode, right? If I switch this over, I'm in the 12 dB state variable filter. So what might happen is that you might be playing a note, for example, and you might be misdiagnosing where your filter is, and you might have something, the filter might actually be stopping the sound from coming out. So it's always good, especially if it's running in series, the sound gets very quiet because it's actually running through this filter and then this filter. And then if it's running in parallel, both of these filters are operating in parallel or side by side. So it's very good to be able to just know where that's at. And that's really it in terms of starting to get a voice together. Then obviously you start to change the oscillator ranges maybe, start to work on a sound. And then if I turn that down, then I can start to think, well, what am I going to do with my second voice? And then, so you might just start to bring oscillators up in the second voice and just work entirely with the second voice and get something that you're happy with there. Okay, and so where the synth gets really fun though is, in my mind, in the sequencer and what the sequencer can do. So what I'll do first off is start sequencing the upper voice, and I'll just run it. Turn the mixer up. Okay, so now we're sequencing that oscillator. You'll see the lights scanning in a linear way forward through the sequencer, but we're not hearing every attack. It's because there's a switch here that allows me to switch between upper and lower voices, which means that I can actually sequence alternately between those two synths. So you're just hearing the attacks that are switched to the upper part of the sequencer. And you'll notice that there's no frequency change. And the other thing that you should do when you're diagnosing this machine is make sure that all of these switches up the top here are set to the central position. Otherwise you're going to get a confusion between the voltage step that the sequencer is on, even if it's not running, and the voltage that you're trying to work with over here when you're generating your synth voice. So make sure those are all in the central position, and then what I can do is the sequencer is divided into column A and column B, and I have the choice to manipulate the voltage of this first oscillator only with column A by flicking this switch. You'll notice that the pitch only changes when the sequencer is in column A and not when it's in column B. Well, there is a setting where I could take a little from column A and a little from column B, which means it'll change on both sides of the sequencer. Strangely, there isn't an option for controlling it just with the B side of the sequencer. So, having done that, I can introduce the second voice. So I flick this to sequencer. Now all of the switches that are set to the lower voice will activate that sound. And again, this is oscillator 4, 5, and 6, so I can decide to only change the pitch of oscillator 4 on the A side, which looks like it only has one attack. Then the sequencer itself has some amazing functionality. Just simply sticking it on a random pattern. I like the multiple steps. You can make every step hit twice, 3 times, 4 times. Huge amount of variation in that. But anyway, that's just an overview of how you might get started with the Grp A8.